Our headline story: Africa's debt burden. The burden of debt has become a weight on many African nations, and the coronavirus pandemic further added to the financial strain on the continent. Can African countries further accommodate more debt? What's the money being used for? Will Africa find its way out of this debt trap somewhere in the future? I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now, Kenya's lawmakers are saying that the country may be heading toward a default unless the government of President Uhuru Kenyatta revamps its debt. According to a report released by the Parliamentary Budget Office, the East African country's debt servicing costs are poised to surge to a record 1.17 trillion shillings. That's about $11 billion in the financial year starting July 1st. Calls to revamp the nation's rising debt are growing louder, even as it plans to borrow as much as $7.3 billion in the Eurobond market over the next few years. This prompted the International Monetary Fund to say that the country may be at the risk of debt distress. By the year through 2024, Kenya's debt servicing expenses will have more than doubled from 2020, with spending on development infrastructure remaining little changed. But it's not just Kenya where the debt conversation is being had. Across the continent, the increasing cost of servicing debt continues to weigh on the Nigerian government's revenue profile. A PwC report titled Nigeria Economic Alert, assessing the 2021 FGN budget, pointed out that Nigeria keeps spending a huge amount of its revenue to service debt, and the debt-to-revenue ratio in 2020 is about 83%. In South Africa, the country also has a debt burden, and the current recession is not helping. The country's debt-to-GDP ratio in October 2020 was 82.76%. The South African Treasury projects the national debt to increase to 4.38 trillion rand in 2022-2023 due to expanded government expenditures and slow economic growth. Joining me is geo-economist and macro analyst Ali Khan Sachu. He is also the CEO of Rich Management. Ali Khan, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge. It's good to see you again.
You too. Thank you for having me.
So let's get straight into this. Now, this is one of the few instances we've seen lawmakers on the continent sort of really push back when it comes to these debts and these loan conversations. We've seen a lot of Kenyans as well be very vocal about how they feel the country is going. But the question has to be asked. Do you think the lawmakers and Kenyans right now are really right to be concerned about the state of borrowing and the debt profile of the country?
Absolutely. I think it's like being in a tunnel and you can see the light and it's coming to you fast, coming towards you faster and faster. And at some point it's going to run you over. And I think, we've reached the point in Kenya where you can say to yourself, it's going to run us over in a couple of years unless we do something quite dramatic. And I think this is not just unique to ourselves. A lot of African countries find themselves in the same situation. We've borrowed far too much money. We've spent it typically on very poorly thought out projects. And we're now, on that treadmill where we're having to borrow just to keep our head above water. It's very unfortunate, I'm afraid.
All right, let's get into what you are calling poorly thought out plans and, I guess, projects. Loans have led Kenya to getting a record 1.1 trillion shillings in debt. You're saying some of these projects that the loans are going towards are poorly thought out. What do you mean by that? Why is this spending possibly not achieving its aim?
I think, for a lot of African countries, governments were attracted to ideas like flagship infrastructure projects, which were based on optimal growth curves, very little feasibility studies done around these investments. You take, for example, Kenya's largest infrastructure project, which is the railway. One could have rehabilitated the old railway for about 10% of the cost. But of course, had we done that, you wouldn't have had money spinning off for various other issues. And this is symptomatic, I think, of the African disease. We've spent money on projects which just simply have no return on investment for the foreseeable future. I don't. We have agency amongst our governments. These decisions were made because you can cut a ribbon, but did they stimulate our economies? That's the challenge. They clearly didn't.
So there are some public finance management rules that Kenya is supposed to be abiding by, and they're saying, of course, that these borrowing, the loans that are being got on the international markets and the Eurobonds are specifically for funding projects, development projects. So what I'm getting from you is that it's questionable whether or not it has actually done that the borrowing has really funded development projects for Kenya. Is this your opinion? Is this something that a lot of research is backing up? What's the stance? Because if there are finance management rules, there's also somebody overseeing how the money comes in and how the money is being dispersed.
So I think if I try to analyze what you're asking, the question is first, when we borrow these enormous amounts of money, were they all applied to the projects for which they were meant to have been applied for?
Yes.
Look, projects were massively inflated, and we paid over $5 to $6 billion for the railway, which really should have cost no more than $2 billion. Now, the next question is, where has the other money gone? And it's gone in all kinds of places where it's never going to produce a return. So we've taken on borrowing of $6 billion, but the investment is $2 billion, and the return on that investment is always going to be a factor of $2 billion. So you're never going to be able to support $6 billion. Then the next problem is that, so you basically over-borrowed. You haven't applied it correctly, and you haven't got a return that can justify the borrowing that is sitting on your balance sheet. And this is pretty much across the board. I don't want to blame China per se, but China was throwing money around. They knew a lot of the money was then going into elections and other issues. And you've seen the problem, hit the wall in Zambia already. They've defaulted on their debt. And now Kenya is in a situation where we're having to borrow just to meet the recurrent expenditure component of the government. You pointed that out, that very little money is going into development spending. Well, we haven't got any money left over. And currently, all the money that we are collecting in tax is needed just to meet interest payments and any principal payments. So there's absolutely no money left over. We've been fortunate and we've been able to kick the can down the road simply because Kenya is important from a geo-economic perspective, particularly because the neighborhood has become quite dangerous. Think of Ethiopia, for example. And therefore, the World Bank and the IMF have thrown us some cheap money, and that's allowed us to kick the can down the road for maybe a couple more years. But, this can't continue. Any economist will tell you that, we are now facing the barrel of a gun.
It's interesting you mentioned that. So I want to get into some of the repayment terms, because there is a school of thought that says it's not the fact that Africa is borrowing, it's the rate, the interest rate that Africa has to pay back. That's the issue. So in terms of the loans for Kenya right now, what are the repayment terms for the loans? What's the interest rate? Where are the plans, the stated plans from whether the Treasury or the government of Uhuru Kenyatta in terms of the plans to repay these loans?
So I think you're completely right. And this is not just a Kenyan phenomenon. For example, in the last few years, the Eurobond market opened up for African issuers. And most African countries went to the Eurobond market. Now, Eurobond interest rates are considerably higher. So if you look, you have concessional funding in 10, 15, 20 years ago. Most African countries were borrowing very cheap money via concessional funding. Then you had huge lending come out of China, mostly versus infrastructure projects. And that lending was not cheap. Most of it was at quite high interest rates. China would say, look, it costs us a lot of money to borrow ourselves. We're on lending to you. So that money was not cheap. Then the Eurobond market, where African governments have borrowed, has not been cheap either. It's been about 400 to 450 basis points higher, or even more than concessional funding. So two things have happened. African governments have bloated their balance sheets, they've borrowed more money, and the money they've borrowed is at much higher interest rates. So it's a double whammy. I think President Adressing of the African Development Bank called it hamburger debt, i.e., it's just putting on weight, but it's not really giving you any more muscle. So you're precisely correct. We borrowed more money, it's more expensive money, and now the day of reckoning has arrived. Unfortunately, I think, we were like children, who had not been in a toy shop, and all of a sudden we're in a toy shop and we want to grab this and grab that loan and grab that loan without really thinking about how we're going to repay it. And it's very unfortunate now. This will have to be dealt with. I mean, ultimately, I sort of remember Adesina and Stiglitz basically pronouncing that it's not possible for African governments to pay back this debt. At some point, we're going to have to deal with it. But, the nature of the markets is people prefer to extend and pretend for as long as they can.
All right. So, Ali Khan, hold on. You mentioned people pretending and extending for as long as they can. Now, the Central Bank of Kenya governor has asked for an extension. There's also a major deficit that the Treasury is speaking about that's worse than what the government and international lenders are saying. We'll get more into this conversation as we look at Africa's debt burden with a focus on Kenya. Stay with us. This is Business Edge right here on News Central. My guest is Ali Khan Sachu. He is the CEO of Rich Management. Now, Ali Khan, we're looking, of course, at Kenya's debt burden particularly, but we know that the Central Bank of Kenya governor has asked for an extension on the 6-month debt service holiday that Kenya has already gotten. And you talked about kicking these issues down the line, kicking the can down the line, and everybody looking at how Africa will repay. Do you think that Kenya will get this extension? What could possibly be considered if they would extend this particular one for Kenya?
I think Kenya is going to be one of a number of countries which is going to apply for that extension. And it's not reducing the principal amount that is owed. It's just giving countries further breathing room by deferring interest payments for a period of time. So we should, I see no reason why Kenya will not get it, given the current atmosphere in general, which is to try and assist African countries as much as possible. So I expect Kenya to apply for that lengthening of the period of the interest moratorium. And I expect other African countries to also apply for that extension. The concern amongst Kenya and some countries was that the ratings agencies, by dint of application into this program, would be downgrading African issuers and therefore impact the price of Eurobonds in particular, making it more difficult for governments to raise money from that particular source. But it seems to me for now that ratings agency action is not hurting bond prices materially. Bond prices seem to be reacting to whether countries are in some kind of IMF or World Bank program, and that seems to be the dividing line. If you're in a IMF program, the bond price seems to be protected. It's where you're not that problems are going to occur. For example, in Ethiopia, where you've got a problem developing, and you've had the Americans now telling the IMF and World Bank not to lend unless it's a humanitarian related loan. You could see pretty dramatic price move there, for example.
All right. So something interesting. Now, last month, when it was announced that the IMF had approved 234 billion shillings financing package for Kenya, there was outrage across board. The hashtag IMF Stop Loaning Kenya was trending on social media. According to the IMF, the facility is to help finance the country's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and also prevent debt distress. But it is the same IMF that is saying that the country is a high risk for debt default. In terms of the IMF lending, but then also saying that Kenya is at risk of debt distress and is also a country that they're looking at in terms of this. How does this work? They're lending them money. It's not to say they have to completely stop, but is this not sort of the devil in the deep blue sea kind of situation here? Kenya needs this money. We're getting it from these people, but these are the same people who are warning about our financial states. How does that all sort of equal out?
Yes, I mean, it was pretty dramatic. I think the Kenyans on Twitter, who are quite notorious and famous, actually invaded one of the IMF functions and completely took over the feed one day, I can recall. Look, what the IMF was saying, first of all, Kenya has always been reasonably close with the IMF. A lot of our policymakers, the central bank governor, for example, are ex-IMF officials. So there's been a synchronization between our policymakers and the IMF. What the IMF was saying, basically, is saying, if we don't make this loan, you're going to have job losses. This is what Mr. Selassie said. And you're going to be far worse off. And therefore, we're looking at it in that context. The IMF is a lender of last resort, essentially. When you're going to the IMF, you're basically giving up a great deal of your agency running your economy. And, the fact of the matter is we are in a difficult spot. And the IMF has come to the rescue and made us loans, which also have the beneficial effect of signaling to the wider market that we're still within the parameters of the IMF. We haven't fallen off, unlike Lusaka, where that's happened. Kenyans, of course, are very unhappy because what they're saying is we've borrowed all this money, but we can't see it. We've misspent it. And we simply don't trust the bona fides of our government in managing the debt burden. And I think that's the quandary for now. The IMF is saying, well, if we don't come in, you're going to have terrible problems. And Kenyans saying, well, each time anyone's lent us a lot of money, it's just compounded the problem.
All right, Ali Khan, we'll start wrapping up, but I have to ask this question. Do you think there is a possibility of Kenya defaulting on her loan? So, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, they released documents for the 2021-2022 financial year. It shows Kenya's debt position is more precarious than both the government and international lenders are making it out to be. So the Treasury's latest figures indicate that the fiscal deficit gap in spending that governments will have to fill by borrowing is around 952 billion Kenyan shillings, just really under 1 trillion Kenyan shillings. And that's about $15 billion higher than the figure presented in the budget policy statement earlier this year. No one wants to mention an economy like Kenya defaulting. We've seen it happen with Zambia. No one wants to sort of address the biggest elephant in the room right now. We also know that Africa's debt is standing almost about $500 billion across the continent, if not more, given the situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think there is the potential for a country like Kenya to default? Maybe not tomorrow, maybe 2 years from now, maybe 3 years from now, 4 years from now, as this debt profile continues to rise?
Yes, essentially, I think the way you framed it is completely correct. I don't think it's going to happen right now because Kenya has received a lot of support from the likes of the IMF and the World Bank. But imagine the scenario as this problem becomes worse because, the amounts become greater, interest payments compound, and, there's only so much you can squeeze a lemon being a Kenyan citizen to pay. We've had increases in taxes, we've had increases in fuel prices, and it's reaching its tolerance limit. So, this scenario, you could have a default in 12, 24 months, unless the IMF come and bail us out again, or where if the market conditions change dramatically and we are unable to borrow money in the Eurobond market in order to